I will keep my remarks very brief to allow as much time as possible for everyone to have an opportunity to engage and ask questions. I want to extend my sincere appreciation to Special Envoy Stern for taking the time to provide this public briefing. As you might know, I'm the proud sister of a trans brother and a gender nonconforming sibling, so the issues facing the LGBTQ+ community have always been really close to my heart. On February 4th, 2021, the Biden administration announced commitments to advancing the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons around the world, building upon the historic 2011 Obama administration memo, which directed departments and agencies engaged abroad to ensure that U.S. diplomacy and foreign assistance promote and protect the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons everywhere. A little over 1 year later, we've seen the administration make progress to uphold these commitments, including updates to deficiencies within the Department of State human rights reporting, the appointment of Special Envoy Stern, an end to a policy that denied American citizenship to the children of same-sex couples born abroad, and more. And these achievements have come at a moment in history where we are seeing the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons and even children and their families being aggressively targeted and diminished simply for being who they are, not only abroad, but also right here in many states across America. And I want to briefly address Ukraine. The rights and safety of LGBTQI+ individuals, particularly trans individuals, are under threat right now. They're often targets of violence, which is especially the case in a war zone with an invading force that is particularly intolerant towards the LGBTQI+ community. We're also hearing how difficult it has been for trans individuals to leave Ukraine for fear of safety and harassment. So I call on the United States to work with Ukraine and neighboring countries to do everything we can to ensure safe passage right now. Our work is far from over, and we still have much further to go in protecting the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons and securing those rights for generations to come. I look forward to hearing Special Envoy Stern's updates on progress on these issues and how the United States can lead the way. So first, I will turn to Representative Cicilline, the co-chair of the LGBTQ+ Equality Caucus and the sponsor of the Landmark Equality Act and the Bipartisan Global Respect Act. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I too want to thank Chairman Meeks and Ranking Member McCall for holding this really important briefing. And I want to particularly acknowledge the extraordinary leadership of Chairman Meeks in this committee and really taking on LGBTQI rights around the world. And this is just one more example of that. This has been a time of both triumph and strife for the LGBTQI+ community here at home and abroad. On the one hand, after years of struggle, I'm encouraged by progress in countries like Angola, which finally legalized same-sex relationships last year, and in Botswana, which legalized same-sex relationships in 2019 through the tireless work of NGOs like Lega Bibo, which I'm proud that USAID supports. But at the same time, we've seen too many countries moving backwards, countries like Hungary, where next month there will be a referendum on a new law that would ban any discussion of LGBTQ people in schools, eerily familiar to what students, parents, and teachers are experiencing in Florida. The United Nations independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity found that COVID has led to an increase in intimate partner violence in LGBTQI+ couples, that the LGBTQI+ community has had less access to healthcare, and that we've been used as scapegoats for the pandemic. Relatedly, during the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen a surge of violence and discrimination against the LGBTQI+ community around the world, including here in the United States. For all these reasons, the Special Envoy to advance the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons has a big job ahead, and I am thrilled that President Biden has appointed Special Envoy Stern to this role at USAID. As the former executive director of Outright Action International, she has deep relationships with the groups working in many of the countries struggling with LGBTQI+ violence and discrimination. She also had extensive experience on these difficult and complex issues, and she's extremely well qualified for the work ahead with a deep commitment to human rights and equality. So I welcome Special Envoy Stern here today and look forward to a very productive discussion. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Cicilline. I will now turn to Representative Titus, sponsor of the GLOBE Act and a longtime champion of the effort to secure the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons at home and abroad.
Thank you very much, Representative Jacobs, and thank you for holding this discussion that is so timely and so critical. I thank Mr. Cicilline for the work that he has done in this area, pushing forward legislation. So it's not just a case of do as I say, not as I do. We are really doing it. And Special Envoy Stern, what a pleasure to have you here and to see the priorities that you've set and the accomplishments that you've made the short time that you've been part of the current administration. So in this role. So thank you very much. We know that we've got to continue to discuss and develop policies to assist the global LGBTI plus community all around the world, because around the world, these individual rights are being consistently denied simply because of who people are and whom they love. The call for fundamental human rights to be honored and protected globally is not new. It's been a central element of U.S. foreign policy for much of the last century. But now it's time to extend those rights and that agenda to cover the LGBTI plus community. We saw great strides under the Obama administration, which created a framework and a whole of government approach to protecting these individuals. I commend Special Envoy Stern, as I said, for taking on this role at this critical time, because we know that we were derelict as a country in our duties under the previous administration. So there's a lot of work to be done to undo what they did, as well as move the agenda forward. Unfortunately, during times of instability, as we saw this past summer in Afghanistan, and we're currently seeing in Ukraine, the LGBTQI plus community faces heightened risk, even more so than other people who are being refugees or fighting or in battlefield states. So they're difficult. I'm getting some action here over my shoulder. Excuse me for the interruption. Many of the actions taken by the Biden administration in support of the LGBTQI community. Okay. I look forward to hearing what we're doing as part of on this committee to support the your role, Ms. Stern, in putting forth these provisions that the Biden administration has stated they support. But what can Congress do? We have the GLOBE Act. We have Mr. Cicilline's legislation. What can this committee do to actually legislatively help you in the task that you have ahead? We're seeing, as I just got this note, progress being made in some places. The Guatemalan Congress just voted to make same-sex marriage illegal, but surely we can have a role to play there, as well as in other countries where such actions are being taken and progress is not being made. So I look forward to the discussion, and I thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Titus. I will now turn to our esteemed briefer, Special Envoy Stern, for her opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Representative Jacobs, and thank you all for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm really pleased to be here. I was honored to join the State Department 5 months ago, and there has been much to do. I recently reviewed the LGBTQI plus sections of our forthcoming human rights report. My office also led the drafting and coordination of what will be the first ever annual report on whole of government efforts to promote and protect LGBTQI plus persons across U.S. foreign policy. No other country in the world has launched a similar public LGBTQI plus report, and so I'm happy to say we are breaking new ground. These reports inspire me because they document that progress is happening. Consider Serbia, for example, which in 2021 amended its anti-discrimination law to include protections on the basis of sex characteristics, or Vietnam, which is considering changing its gender identity recognition law. While LGBTQI plus persons in these countries still face many challenges, these are important advances that can save lives. Yet, the truth is that these reports also leave me with a profound sense of urgency. Global data makes clear that the dehumanization of LGBTQI plus persons is systemic, pervasive, and violent. In Senegal, for instance, in the days after a large anti-LGBTQI+ rally in May, at least 4 LGBTQI+ persons that we know of were assaulted. Each attack was filmed and posted online, potentially outing the victims. And in each incident, the police arrested the victim. Sadly, Senegal's problems in this area are not unique. State and non-state actors target LGBTQI+ persons for violence and discrimination around the world. And so it pains me to tell you that in recent years, I have witnessed the rise of new forms of attack on LGBTQI+ persons. We see the increased criminalization of the exercise of freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly, and association when LGBTQI+ persons dare to assert their human rights. The targeting and harassment of LGBTQI+ persons sometimes track closely with election cycles, underscoring how cynical and premeditated these efforts can be. These attacks have proven themselves to be highly effective strategies, not only to undermine the basic dignity of LGBTQI+ persons, but also to undermine the values of the rule of law and inclusive democracy. The framework for the US government's efforts is the Presidential Memorandum on Advancing the Human Rights of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer, and Intersex persons around the world, which President Biden issued in February 2021. Let me explain the methodology that I used to animate the memorandum. First, quite simply, the North Star of my work is to counter discrimination and violence. The emphasis on discrimination and violence facilitates ambitious long-term priorities like decriminalization or legal gender recognition, and newer priorities as well, like ending so-called conversion therapy, so-called corrective rape, or forced anal exams. Second, my office regularly consults with local and international LGBTQI+ human rights defenders and organizations. They know when and how to push for progress, and they also inform me when public US engagement could harm more than help, critical information that is always needed. Third, we provide technical expertise across the State Department to sound the alarm and identify opportunities. Fourth, we advocate for data disaggregation because LGBTQI+ persons are not monolithic. They can face additional discrimination in healthcare, education, and jobs because of their LGBTQI+ status, but this double discrimination can also occur based on factors related to age, race, ethnicity, origin, disability, religion, gender, or immigration status. Fifth, we invest not only in countering hate, but also in nurturing opportunity. The US government can make a transformative difference by investing in places where the winds of change are blowing in the right direction. As we already heard, Botswana, for instance, decriminalized homosexuality through its courts this year. And we must celebrate forward momentum in Botswana and in every country and region in the world. The United States is not the only government working to defend human rights for LGBTQI+ persons globally, thankfully. Nor is our domestic work complete to respect and ensure the human rights of LGBTQI+ Americans. However, as we center human rights in our foreign policy, the United States has the means to create an outsized global impact. The US government has significant diplomatic infrastructure around the world. We manage the Global Equality Fund, which is the premier multilateral funding mechanism for LGBTQI rights globally. This year, passing $102 million in total grants awarded across 100 countries. And our public support for human rights of LGBTQI+ persons helps put perpetrators on notice and rally like-minded partners. So in conclusion, we must seize the opportunity that we have today to more fully embody the American dream of inclusive democracy. In doing so, we can accelerate the pace of change for LGBTQI plus persons worldwide. We can take a transformative leap forward for full equality for all persons in our lifetime, regardless of who they are or who they love. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Special Envoy Stern. I will now recognize members for questioning. We have only 90 minutes with the Special Envoy, so I will ask everyone to be mindful of time to allow for a thoughtful, inclusive conversation and to allow as many of us as possible to engage in the conversation.
Hey, Strother.
And I will start by recognizing myself. So as we mentioned earlier, it's been a little over a year since President Biden's February 2021 memorandum on advancing the human rights of LGBTQI plus persons around the world. So can you provide an overview of the actions taken to date by executive branch agencies to implement the memo and its directive?
I'd be happy to, Representative Jacobs, and thank you so much for that question. Well, I would emphasize that there has been a lot of success using the presidential memorandum as the framework. And I'm proud that so many of the interventions that have been executed under the memorandum have happened because each one helps advance the goal of ending violence and discrimination. And so rather than focus on one intervention, I just want to highlight several that stand out to me. For the heart of your question, I would direct you to the forthcoming first ever public report on the US government's implementation of the memorandum, which details across all of our foreign assistance agencies a compendium of interventions. And part of what was so exciting to me as we worked on that report is that every foreign assistance agency had something to report and something of substance. And I think that's going to be a tremendous tool for members of Congress, for civil society, and for the media to see the efforts that the Biden administration is making, to see the complexity of this work, and also to hold us accountable, to keep the pressure on so that we're driving this agenda forward. I also want to highlight the fact that the US will soon make passports available with the option of choosing a third gender, which is an enormous achievement. Moving forward in a way that is going to really change people's lives. And I also want to emphasize that the forthcoming human rights report will be the most inclusive ever published. So I think that's a very short way of trying to answer your question. But there are so many examples that have been remarkable, and we're just getting started.
Well, thank you for all of your work on that. During a side event at the Summit for Democracy last year, you announced the State Department supported Global LGBTQI plus Inclusive Democracy and Empowerment Fund, the GLIDE Fund, which aims to facilitate the participation and leadership of LGBTQI plus community members in democratic institutions. When does the department anticipate the launch of the GLIDE Fund, and how will this aid our efforts to meet our commitments to uphold the human rights of LGBTQI plus members around the world?
That's a really important question. We expect to award the GLIDE grant to a civil society implementing partner by the end of this fiscal year, so by the end of September. I want to emphasize why the GLIDE Fund is so important. The GLIDE Fund seeks to support human rights initiatives that are challenging democratic institutions from an LGBTQI specific lens. So that could take many forms, but the fundamental premise of it is that LGBTQI plus persons are often a canary in the coal mine. And when and where we see attacks on LGBTQI plus persons, we see the erosion of the rule of law. We see the erosion of democratic institutions. And so the kinds of projects that GLIDE could support are not only good for LGBTQI plus persons and their personal safety, they're good for all people because they could help build stronger democratic institutions. So the kinds of projects we envision supporting would include, for instance, responding to the increase in hate speech targeting LGBTQI plus persons during political campaigns, fostering dialogue with political parties to integrate inclusive policies into their platforms, ensuring voting rights for all persons, regardless of sex assigned at birth, and even fundamental concepts like advocating for diversity in government. So I'm really pleased that this mechanism exists. And I can't wait for it to be rolled out so that we can see the effects of the work in creating more inclusive policies and programs for all.
Well, thank you. And I too look forward to seeing its rollout. Lastly, what successes and challenges have you faced as the Special Envoy in terms of leading or overseeing implementation of the memorandum and your work in the department?
I haven't figured out how to give up sleep or how to clone myself. So that's been a big problem. But I assume that once I hit the 6-month mark, I'll have resolved that. I think the truth is that one of the biggest challenges is that my office is in incredibly high demand. We are being contacted with requests for technical assistance from desks and embassies around the world because many people within the State Department have recognized that LGBTQI people are living with incredibly high rates of discrimination and violence, and they want to do something about it. And we just wish we had all the resources in the world to respond to them and give them the technical assistance they're asking for.
Well, thank you. My time has expired. I will now turn it over to our moderator for member questions.
Thank you. Representative Cicilline.
Thank you very much. And thank you. Before I begin, I just want to say I'm really proud to belong to a caucus that has been just in general so supportive of LGBTQI plus equality. And I would particularly want to acknowledge the member chairing this committee, Congresswoman Jacobs, for her longtime support of our community, and also Dina Titus for her heroic work and great legislation. And thank you, Special Envoy, for being here. It's great to see you. Last year, I organized an appropriations letter that was signed by 123 members of the House requesting $60 million annual in global funding to fund the president's vision and the human rights agenda set in the global LGBTQI plus presidential memorandum issued a year ago. And while we were able to secure a historic increase, about 56% in these funds in the omnibus, we didn't get it quite to the level of last year, and I'm hopeful we will this year. But how important is U.S. government funding to the movement of LGBTQI plus equality? And could it be deployed efficiently and effectively to promote human rights and economic opportunities for targeted LGBTQI plus minorities globally?
Thank you so much, Representative Cicilline, for that question. I'm always really happy to get a question about the resourcing of human rights movements worldwide. There's not a human rights movement in the world that has enough resources. But without a doubt, LGBTQI plus rights are one of the most underfunded categories of human rights and development. And I would go so far as to say there is a dangerous funding gap for LGBTQI plus issues globally. So I just want to rattle off a couple of examples. Let's think about COVID for a moment. Out of 4,500 recorded COVID-19 resource mechanisms, only one explicitly described funding to support LGBTQI plus communities. Globally, there's approximately $560 million a year given in philanthropic funding to support LGBTQI rights. So one could argue that number could be a lot bigger, but it's not a bad place to start. But of that number, approximately 300 million went to LGBTQI rights in the United States. And by contrast, just 260 million was given to all other countries in the world combined. So let me put that in slightly more stark terms. For the Middle East and North Africa, just $7 million. Or for all of Asia and the Pacific, where of course, the region with the highest population in the world, just $31 million. And so I'm sharing these numbers to emphasize to your question, Representative Cicilline, that one of the most important things that the US could do to advance safety and security of LGBTQI plus persons globally is quite simply to increase funding of this work.
Right.
And I also have data from DRL if it's helpful to you.
Yes,
and
I would love that. I just want to be sure I can get it one more question.
Okay, I'll just rattle this one fact off, which is that DRL can only fund approximately 15% of the proposals that it receives. So clearly, we could do more with more resources.
Great. we're going to fight to be sure that happens. So my last question is, the United States is a founding and active participant in the Equal Rights Coalition of like-minded governments that are coordinating internationally to promote the rights of LGBTQI plus communities. And in June, the United Kingdom will host a high-level meeting of the ERC to measure progress and recognize new government commitments to promote LGBTQI plus equality globally. So my first question is, will you participate, and will the US government send high-level representation at the level of Secretary Blinken or even higher? And since I understand this will also be a pledging conference, what new US commitments is the administration considering to be made on the global stage?
Thanks for your question about the Equal Rights Coalition. Having been a part of the ERC from the start, I know the mechanism well. We have not yet been formally invited to the Equal Rights Coalition conference, but I can confirm that we will have representation there. I will lead a small delegation to the conference, and I unfortunately, I can't yet confirm what other senior US representatives will attend. As for the role of pledging at the conference, I might push back a little bit on your characterization of the conference and say it certainly is a pledging conference for the host countries. It has not been as much of a pledging conference for other participants, but I can assure you that we'll use the conference as an opportunity to celebrate commitments and announce forthcoming opportunities.
Great. Thank you so much. And I yield back, Madam Chair.
Representative Manning.
Thank you. And thank you for being with us today, Special Envoy Stern. It's wonderful to hear from you. Issue. I'm sure you're aware of some of the oppressive restrictions LGBTQI plus people face in the Middle East, particularly in Gaza under Hamas rule. And I'm wondering if you can talk to us about some of the ways that we can leverage the GLIDE and Global Equity Funds to support advancing LGBTQ rights and freedoms in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in the wider Middle East.
Thank you so much, Representative Manning, for that question. And it is a pleasure to be here with you. You know, I would answer that question in the same way I would answer the question for any country context, any regional context, which is it's a layered approach. Sometimes it's going to involve public diplomacy, but most of the time, I think our engagement will involve private diplomacy. And I'm actually really happy that you posed that question following the data that I shared, because with just $7 million going to support LGBTQI rights annually in that region, you can imagine how much more impact there could be if there was more significant resources for human rights activists. There would be more human rights documentation. There would be more training of service providers. There would be more relationship building with government officials. And I would emphasize that after my career of close to 25 years working with human rights activists, not only in that region, but in other regions, one of the most effective strategies we can support is intersectionality. And I emphasize intersectionality because in places where sodomy laws or morality laws or cross-dressing laws are on the books, we might not succeed in the near term in seeing those laws and policies go away, but we should be focused on how to drive down violence at the community level. And I think there are a lot of opportunities to do that through ensuring space for civil society, the free press, the rule of law, and other fundamentals of free and fair democracies. So as you can tell, it's a question that I'm rather passionate about, but I think the answer is in complex places, it's never a one-size-fits-all strategy.
And can you be effective in actually changing cultural biases against LGBTQI people?
Well, one of the questions I'm always asked is, are LGBTQI rights anti-culture or anti-tradition? And the answer to that is, of course, no. LGBTQI rights are a part of every culture and every tradition on the planet. I don't think the US government can ever drive, I don't think the US government is going to be most effective driving culture change. I think culture change has to come from within. And where we're going to be most helpful is by supporting LGBTQI people who really are They're fighting to be seen and heard. They're fighting for even recognition by mainstream organizations. And I think where we can be helpful, it takes many forms, big and small. Even inviting LGBTQI activists and civil society to NGO briefings and consultations we have at our embassies around the world, which helps bring
Representative Jacobs, we are live again. I'm going to ask Representative Castro to begin his questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Jessica, for your time today and for your work on these very important issues. Under current State Department policy described as, quote, neither for nor against, U.S. embassies have been instructed to remain neutral on marriage equality campaigns in other countries, even those engaged in active public discourse. And last October, I sent a letter that called for the State Department to update its policies and allow U.S. embassies to speak up in favor of same-sex marriage equality as a human right that our country recognizes and supports. This letter was signed by 60 members of Congress. In response to my letter, I was told that the State Department is conducting a review of this policy. Can you tell us where that review stands now? And when will the policy review be completed and made public?
Thank you for your question, Representative Castro. And I really appreciate the pink behind you. I don't know if that's in honor of today or just a really good aesthetic decision all the time. On this question, we are giving it our fullest consideration as we conveyed to you in that letter. And without a doubt, we are guided by the policy priorities of LGBTQI plus persons, human rights defenders, and organizations in individual countries. We support and have supported, as appropriate and in consultation with local stakeholders, efforts to advance the fundamental freedoms of opinion and expression, peaceful assembly and association that allow for peaceful and safe discussions of same-sex marriage, full stop. Beyond that, I want to emphasize that married or not, LGBTQI plus couples and their families are valid and valuable. And we've sought opportunities to convey this again and again. Discrimination and stigma not only harm LGBTQI plus couples and their children, but all of society. My hope is to have additional information to share with you by Pride season this year.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And, I understand that the department's efforts in this review follow the principle of do no harm. And this is fine in principle. However, overarching U.S. policy should not be watered down, I think, out of fear, as you know. Instead, advocacy can take a metered approach based on our diplomats' expert understanding of the culture and political situation of the countries in which they're operating. Clearly, strong advocacy in countries where homosexuality is criminalized may be harmful to the movement of human rights for LGBTQI individuals in general. But in countries where movement towards same-sex marriage is part of the domestic discourse, for example, in Chile, where marriage equality legislation recently passed both houses of their Congress by an overwhelming majority and was signed into law, our diplomats can and should speak to how the U.S. has advanced this issue. I wanted to address one more subject with you. LGBTQI Department of State employees and their spouses continue to face challenges receiving diplomatic accreditation to many countries around the world. During a November hearing, I asked Deputy Secretary for Management and Resources, Brian McKeon, about State Department actions to push for accreditation for these diplomats and their families. And I'm now sending a letter to Secretary Blinken, urging him to prioritize raising diplomatic accreditation for LGBTQI diplomats and their families at the highest levels in all Department of State interactions. Can you speak to your office's efforts to support and advance diplomatic accreditation for LGBTQI diplomats and their families?
I can say that it's an issue that I'm concerned with as someone who has a wife. So I'm very sympathetic to the importance of this for all of my colleagues. And this is a significant priority for anyone who is an LGBTQI plus employee at the State Department. And I speak regularly with GLIFA, which is the LGBTQI Employee Association, and truly a formidable asset, really. The way I would answer this is twofold. One, I would say this is not squarely within my portfolio because I don't work on human resources issues per se, but of course I'm concerned with the equitable, non-discriminatory treatment of LGBTQI plus persons everywhere. And the second thing I would share is a slightly more anecdotal response, which is that in virtually every meeting that I've had with principals at the State Department, they've conveyed to me the importance of working on the issue of accreditation for same-sex families. And I think it's really essential. And I found the commitment to be quite genuine, and I've observed many current efforts.
Well, thank you for that. And I yield back to her.
Representative Levin.
All right, well, thanks so much, and thanks for joining us. I'm deeply concerned by what seems like a global trend in rising discrimination against trans people. We've seen this in the United States with the proliferation of anti-trans legislation. And I've heard directly from my constituents in Michigan about rising trends of hate crimes against trans people. Could you please comment on how hateful domestic legislation impacts your efforts to advance LGBTQI plus rights abroad? And what can the Biden administration do to reverse these trends?
Even 2 years into the pandemic, it takes forever to find the unmute button when you're on Zoom.
No problem.
Thank you so much for that question. I share your concern about the pervasive violence that transgender and gender nonconforming people face around the world. And countering transphobia is a priority for my office, and manifests in many dimensions of our work. On the macro point that you make, how do human rights at the domestic level impact our foreign policy engagements? I'm going to probably misquote the president, but the concept I've read in his speeches is we're always striving for a more perfect union, and that work is never done. But the way he says it, of course, has even more elegance. What the US says and does at the domestic level impacts our moral authority at the international level. That said, when we haven't, even though we are still striving towards fuller realization and fuller respect and protection for LGBTQI Americans, we still want to do what we can to advance LGBTQI rights in US foreign policy. I think the answer is it's a both and.
Okay, well, that kind of leads to my next question. So let me jump to it. Some of the world's worst offenders in terms of violating LGBTQ rights are among the top recipients of US security assistance. So Egypt, for example, receives $1.3 billion each year in US security assistance, but refused even to recognize the terms sexual orientation and gender identity at all during its most recent universal periodic review at the UN Human Rights Council, effectively denying the existence of LGBTQ people, according to Human Rights Watch. Do you believe that US security assistance gives you leverage to work with foreign officials on LGBTQI plus rights? And can you think of an example where the US has effectively used its leverage to help advance rights?
Does the US security assistance give us leverage? Yes, of course it does. Every component of a bilateral relationship impacts our ability to negotiate with other governments around our priorities, whether they are aligned or they differ. I think the challenge always is how do you take into account all of the different dimensions of a bilateral relationship, whether it's free and fair elections, human rights, security assistance, climate change. There's so many issues. I have to say, I would probably have to get back to you about an example.
Okay, but please do that. I'll really appreciate that. And that'll give me time to ask you one more question quickly. It's about Title 42, and I'm deeply concerned by the Biden administration's decision to continue the previous administration's policy of using Title 42 to justify turning away desperate asylum seekers at our borders. We know that LGBTQI plus migrants face disproportionate risks, yet we've turned vulnerable people back and forced them to remain in Mexico. One study by Human Rights First found that 81% of LGBTQ asylum seekers near the border in Mexico were the victim of an attack or an attempted attack, including rape, human trafficking, kidnapping, and violent assaults, within just 1 month of when they were surveyed. That is shocking, yet the Title 42 policy remains in place. How does the Biden administration's continued Title 42 policy reconcile with US efforts to advance LGBTQI plus rights abroad that you're leading so ably?
Thank you for that question, Representative Levin. I'm actually not well versed in this issue, so I'll have to take that back as well.
Okay, so I really appreciate you taking some homework. My time's expired, Madam Chairwoman, but I really appreciate getting your answers, and I appreciate the great work you do. And with that, I yield back.
Representative Titus.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask you about accessing healthcare services. According to USAID, this is one of the most daunting challenges that confronts the LGBTQI plus community. And of course, it gets worse in times of crisis, like in Afghanistan or Ukraine. People are discriminated against. They can't get access to information. They're stopped from entering clinics. I wonder if you could talk about some of the issues that you have seen that this population faces in accessing health care. And that's not only physical care, but also mental health care, and what your office is doing to kind of address these and how we might be helpful.
Representative Titus, thank you so much for that question. I really appreciate it. I think we don't talk about LGBTQI plus persons' access to health often enough. And if we did, we would probably have better data to report than the incredibly high rates of homicides of LGBTQI plus persons. We would have longer life expectancies to report. But there's so many issues that come up around this. One of our biggest concerns with regard to the situation in Ukraine is, how are people going to get access to HIV meds? How are people going to get access to hormones? What's going to happen when people need routine health care and they have to find a doctor who's not going to mock them for being LGBTQI? So I wouldn't say that I have a standalone strand on this. I would say healthcare just has to be integrated into everything I do.
Well, thank you. Well, if there's anything that we can do to help, please let us know. This committee would be sympathetic to that. And as you incorporate it into your programming, don't forget mental health as well as physical health. Well, thank you. Now I yield back.
Oh, just maybe one word on that, if I may, Representative Titus. Yes. I think I'm so happy you emphasize mental health as well. And the impact of COVID-19, of course, has been horrific on all persons everywhere. But if you're an LGBTQI person who's been impacted by job loss or housing loss, and you had to go back to live with your family who is homophobic or transphobic, then your mental health has just been shattered by the pandemic in a way that is simultaneously like everybody else who's been struggling, but also has had distinct forms of harm. And I read a story by a human rights organization that documented the impact of COVID-19 on LGBTQI plus persons. And the story was about a young gay man who was forced to move back in with his homophobic family as a result of job loss from COVID-19. And he was in he was experiencing so much harassment from his family that he would call a kind of mental health line that was providing psychosocial support via phone. And you know what he had to do to call it? He literally had to go into his bedroom closet to call for help. Metaphorically and literally, people have been suffering from having to go back into the closet. So mental health has never been more important.
You mentioned the high rate of homicide. I would imagine the rate of suicide is also increasing. It's already higher than average.
Well, one thing that would be helpful is if we had better data collection and more research into LGBTQI violence. Unfortunately, I can't persuasively answer that question at the global level. When we look at LGBTQI suicidal ideation and suicide rates, we're using country level or community data. And I think to your point, the severity of the issue really calls for more data collection and more investment in research into this community.
Okay. Well, let's look at that as a possibility for supporting. Thank you very much. I appreciate your being here.
Thank you.
Representative Jacobs, those are all members for the first round if you would like to begin a second round.
Thank you. I will take moderator's prerogative to do another round. So I
did request a question. I don't know if committee didn't get back. This is Representative Brian Mast.
I'm so sorry, Representative Mast. We were told that you did not want to ask a question, but you are recognized to ask 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, ma'am, for your testimony today, and to our other representatives for their question. I have 3 questions. I think they're kind of all part of the same coin. And it was spoken about the credentialing of our diplomats. So just number one, what is the statistic, the data point on this for real time? How many diplomats do we have right now that are being denied their credentials? And then beyond that, assuming that not all diplomats from our country have spouses, how is it that country X is identifying the orientation of a diplomat to say that they're not going to credential them? And the third part of that question being, again, going back to a November hearing that we had with State Department and Human Resources of sorts, and understanding that there's an effort to hire and retain LGBTQI in the State Department. How does the State Department know if somebody is LGBTQI? Because we can't ask that when we hire anybody. So I'm just genuinely curious to know.
No, thank you so much for those questions. And it's helpful to know all three questions so I can try to pace myself over the amount of time that we have. I don't know if the number exists to your first question. How many diplomats do we have being denied credentials? And the reason why I don't know is because not everyone chooses to disclose their sexual orientation, gender identity, or sex characteristics. And especially when people think that disclosure won't lead to the results that they want, they might not choose to disclose. On your second question.
Can I just pause it? So do we know that there's at least one right now? I mean, like, would that be the case? Like, we know for a fact concretely that we have at least one individual from our State Department, one of our diplomats, that is being denied credentials, or do we not even know that right now?
You know, as I said to, I think it was Representative Castro who brought up accreditation. I have an adjacent relationship to the issues of human resources, but it's not squarely one of the issues that I work on. So for that kind of question, I would really have to get back to you. I don't want to misspeak about data gathering or data collection. And it's too serious of an answer it's too serious of a question to opine without being confident. But what I can tell you is I've seen considerable effort to hire and retain LGBTQI employees. And as you astutely point out, people can choose to disclose, but we're never going to mandate it. Of course, having a diverse workforce is an asset to the State Department. More diversity brings more resources and more credibility and more knowledge into our work. It makes the State Department stronger. I would imagine that some of the resources that we use for hiring and retaining LGBTQI employees include fair and equitable access to healthcare and benefits, including for LGBTQI families, for trans-related healthcare. I think that it comes in not so subtle, but really important statements that are made by State Department leadership. For example, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman personally spoke at the State Department's Pride event in June, where we raised the progress flag. That sends a really strong message when the leadership of the department allocates this as a priority in their schedule. And then I think there's another strategy that comes in the relationship between GLIFA and Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley's efforts on DEIA at the State Department. And one thing that makes me happy is that I know that there is a focus on retaining and hiring LGBTQI employees, but I think there's still a lot of work ahead.
Thank you for your answers. I appreciate it.
Did I answer your questions?
In part, as you said, partially, you didn't have an answer to some of the data points about, is this something our diplomats are realistically facing? And again, in turn, when we hear that data point, I would be very curious to know how a foreign country receiving one of our diplomats decides that somebody is whatever it is that they say, or whatever it is the reason is they're denying somebody. I'm curious how they know that. So thank you.
Representative Jacobs.
Great, thank you. Now officially for round two. Sorry about that, Mr. Mast. So I wanted to return to the devastating crisis in Ukraine. As I mentioned in the beginning, we're hearing reports that many trans individuals are finding it difficult to leave for fear of safety and harassment. Many trans individuals in Ukraine do not have ID documents that match their gender identity and are worried they cannot pass internal checkpoints. This makes it especially difficult given our understanding that men ages 18 to 60 are obliged to stay. So those who are perceived to be male or have identification documents with male gender markers are fearful that they will face difficulty or harassment should they choose to leave. Again, this is particularly concerning given that trans individuals are often targets of violence, especially in a war zone with an invading force that is particularly intolerant towards LGBTQ plus individuals. So can you talk about the situation and how the administration is working with Ukraine and neighboring countries to address this to ensure safe passage of trans individuals?
Thanks so much for your question, Representative Jacobs. I would say that my office has been seized with the safety and security of trans Ukrainians, and additionally, the vulnerability of LGBTQI Ukrainians in general. My office has convened multiple consultations and roundtables with both Ukrainian LGBTQI civil society before the invasion began, and then with INGOs and partner organizations in the sort of ring countries, in the surrounding countries, since the war began. The reason for that is because it's of paramount importance to us to get fast breaking information about how people are being targeted, what the problems are. And I think without a doubt, the fact that trans Ukrainians have struggled to cross Ukrainian borders has been top of mind. We have sought examples of where people have not been able to cross borders. We have sought examples of people who have needed assistance because they've been afraid to leave their homes and they have stayed in precarious situations, potentially facing shelling and bombing and worse, simply because their gender identity does not align with their legal documents. And we're seeking opportunities to convey our concerns to the authorities when and where we can. And additionally, I would highlight that we're concerned about potential discrimination and harassment of LGBTQI Ukrainians who leave Ukraine and are traveling to countries in the region that also have their own serious issues with homophobia and transphobia. And we've received some early accounts of police harassment around LGBTQI shelters and other emergency and direct services. And we've also been seized with the issue of trying to ensure that humanitarian support is delivered without discrimination. So the issues of Ukraine are probably the top issue for my office right now. And I share your concerns, and we're doing everything possible to engage. And I'm happy to say that PRM and DRL's Office of Global Programs have also been constant partners in responding to these issues.
Well, thank you and your office for all of your important work on there. And please let us know what more Congress can do to help you with that. I also wanted to talk about the UN LGBTI core group. I understand you were actually a co-founder of the group, so I'd love to get your perspective. Can you talk about the work of the core group and how the State Department is working with the group to drive coordination on these issues at the UN?
I'm happy to talk about the core group. I think it's an incredibly important mechanism for governments to exchange ideas with one another about the ability of the UN system to integrate a full programming for LGBTQI plus persons. The core group, as always, has a robust body of work. My understanding is that the core group was instrumental in the recent passage of a General Assembly resolution on free and fair elections, which made explicit reference to sexual orientation and gender identity, thus becoming only the second resolution in the history of the UN to make reference to sexual orientation and gender identity. And on the core group's agenda will be visibility for LGBTQI issues throughout the year, and also mainstreaming LGBTQI plus issues into the UN's mandate. So So I see that we're almost out of time, but when you ask about one of the things that I know the best about, it's hard to be succinct.
Well, I appreciate that. And I want to thank again Special Envoy Stern for updating us on this critical issue. This is about saving lives, respecting human rights, and upholding our democratic values. No one should live in fear of being assaulted, tortured, or face death threats because of who they are or who they love. And while our briefing today centered on our international efforts as the Foreign Affairs Committee, America must demonstrate leadership by doing at home what we preach abroad. LGBTQI plus civil rights leader and longtime Martin Luther King advisor Bayard Rustin once said, "The proof that one truly believes is in action." So I look forward to working with the Special Envoy to make sure we continue to do just that. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.